The chair was wrong. That was the first thing Ambassador Yael Darro noticed when she walked into the grand convocation hall of the Interstellar Accord. Not the architecture, though it was staggering enough to steal the breath from anyone who had grown up under an ordinary sky. Not the 70-meter walls carved from a mineral so dark it seemed to swallow light whole. Not the ceiling so impossibly high that a thin ribbon of cloud had formed near its upper arches that morning, drifting in perfect silence above the proceedings like something the universe had forgotten to clean up. Not the 51 alien species arranged along a sweeping crescent of elevated platforms, each one representing a civilization that had been crossing between stars while humanity was still arguing over which continent belonged to whom. No, the first thing Yael noticed was that her chair was too tall for her desk, and her desk was placed at the far outer edge of the crescent, and nobody had seen any reason to fix either problem before she arrived. She sat down anyway. She adjusted her posture. She put the translation earpiece in her ear, a model 2 generations behind the current standard, the kind that occasionally dropped the last syllable of a sentence and carried a faint electrical hiss beneath every word, and she looked out at the room that would define the next chapter of human history. Yael was 33 years old. She had grown up in a coastal city in southern Brazil, studied interstellar treaty law at a university most people outside the continent had never heard of, and spent 8 years working in deep space resource arbitration before her government contacted her and told her with very little ceremony that she had been selected as humanity's first permanent ambassador to the Interstellar Accord. She had not been the first choice. She had not been the second, third, or fifth. The original selection had quietly declined. The second candidate had suffered what the official record described as a health interruption, and what the unofficial record described as sitting in a bathtub for 4 days, unable to speak. The third had accepted, flown halfway to the Accord station, and then requested a return transport without explanation. By the time her government reached Yael, the Accord's deadline for Earth to submit credentials was 6 days away. She said yes before they finished explaining what yes meant. That had been 8 weeks ago. Now she was here, in the outermost seat of the grandest deliberative chamber in the known galaxy, wearing a second-rate earpiece and sitting in a chair that made her feel like a child at an adult table, and the 51 civilizations arranged before her had already moved on to the first item of business without so much as a formal acknowledgement that she existed. The hall was called the Chamber of Continuance. The Accord had been meeting inside it for roughly 5,000 years. The architecture had been designed for species taller and wider and in several cases structurally unlike any human body. The dominant powers, the Vithara Dominion, the Soren Collective, the Dreth Assembly, the consolidated houses of Myron, occupied the elevated central platforms, their ambassadors seated on platforms raised above the floor in a way that made it physically impossible to address them without looking upward. The smaller member worlds sat in the outer rings, quiet and largely overlooked, casting votes that were always outnumbered and rarely consulted before decisions were made. Yael had memorized all of it before she left Earth, not just names and homeworlds, but political histories, trade relationships, internal disputes, voting patterns, the specific language of the Accord Charter that governed membership, and all 12,000 pages of the Charter itself, including appendices, procedural amendments, and historical footnotes going back 3,000 years. She had done this over the course of 72 hours, not because she was exceptional, because she had decided that if she was going to sit in a room where every other civilization had a millennium of head start on her, she was going to sit there having done her homework. Nobody in the chamber knew that yet. The session opened. The Vithara administrator announced 12 items on the agenda in a flowing, resonant language that the earpiece converted into something just slightly too formal to feel natural. Yael listened. She watched. She did not speak. She did not raise her indicator panel. She simply observed the room the way she had spent her entire career observing rooms, looking not at what was being said, but at the space between what was said and what was meant. And somewhere in the second hour, sitting in her too-tall chair at the far edge of the most powerful deliberative body in the known galaxy, a feeling settled over her that she had not expected. Not anxiety, not awe, not the vertiginous sensation of being impossibly out of her depth, though those were all present in some measure. It was possibility, because what she saw when she looked at that chamber was not greatness, not anymore. She saw ancient powers moving on ancient rails. She saw alliances held together by tradition rather than trust. She saw the Vithara and the Soren speaking past each other with the comfortable fluency of rivals who had long since stopped actually listening. She saw the smaller member worlds sitting silent in their outer rings, their votes already decided for them by forces they could not reach. She saw a system that had been running on the same assumptions for 5,000 years. And then she looked down at her datapad, at the 12,000 pages of the Accord Charter stored inside it, and she felt something settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock. She smiled. Across the chamber, the Vithara ambassador was moving a procedural motion. The hall hummed with 51 civilizations doing precisely what they had always done in exactly the way they had always done it. Nobody noticed the human smiling, which, as it turned out, was exactly how she needed it.
3 months. That was how long Yael went without saying a single significant word on the floor of the Chamber of Continuance. This made her government contact, a senior diplomat named Rostov Hale, very nearly unwell. Rostov called her every 4 days from a relay station just inside the heliopause. His voice always carried the particular tension of a man watching a clock he could not control. His idea of progress was speeches, formal declarations, recorded objections, anything that proved to the watching universe that Earth was present and engaged, and not simply filling a seat. "You need to be visible," he told her on the 11th call. "You need to make Earth mean something in that room." "I am visible," she said. "I am at every session. I have not missed a single vote." "Voting with the majority every time is not diplomacy, Yael. It is attendance." "It is, for now," she replied. He did not like that, but Rostov was light years away, and Yael was the one in the room. What she was doing in those 3 months was not passive. There is a significant difference between sitting quietly and actually watching. The same difference that exists between hearing a language and understanding it. Yael was tracking everything, every exchange on the floor, every fragment of side conversation she could catch, every pattern in how different species voted and why, and more importantly, every relationship in that chamber that looked stable on the surface but had something fragile running underneath. The Vithara and the Soren maintained a public trade compact that was, in private, deeply strained. The Soren had twice in the past decade quietly rerouted their extraction shipping in ways that undercut Vithara territorial revenues. Both parties knew it. Both continued performing cordiality because neither could afford the diplomatic cost of addressing it openly. That tension was real, it was load-bearing, and it was invisible to anyone who was not watching carefully. The Orin Confederation, 6 smaller species who had pooled into a single council seat roughly 1,000 years ago, was showing fractures. 2 of its member species had been locked in a low-grade territorial dispute for 80 years. The strain showed only in hesitation, a slight delay before certain votes, a pattern of abstentions that did not quite align with stated Orin policy. Nothing anyone would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. The Dreth Assembly, considered the most neutral power in the chamber, had a habit of brokering agreements that left both parties feeling they had received slightly less than they deserved. Nobody could ever demonstrate this conclusively. It was simply the Dreth way, and it had made them indispensable and quietly resented in equal measure. Yael wrote all of it down, not in any networked system, in a paper notebook, the kind sold in ordinary shops in ordinary cities on Earth, using a pen, in a handwriting that required effort to read, because she was not certain who had access to what on Accord Station, and she had not survived 8 years of interstellar resource arbitration by making assumptions about information security. The second thing she was doing was building relationships, not with the ambassadors, but with everyone else. Accord Station was vast, a structure that had been expanded and modified over so many centuries that its original architecture was archaeologically buried beneath layers of renovation. It housed not just the chamber itself, but the entire support infrastructure for 52 diplomatic missions, thousands of staff, translators, archivists, technicians, maintenance workers. Most ambassadors never learned their names. Yael learned all of them. There was an archivist named Feln, a being from a non-member world who had worked in the station's document repository for 19 years and knew exactly which historical records were complete and which had been quietly edited. There was a translation systems technician named Barrett who could tell you, without consulting any official record, which ambassador's earpiece had been upgraded to a priority feed and who specifically requested that. There was an administrative coordinator named Osu who had been managing station logistics for 30 years and communicated in a soft, layered clicking that the translation system rendered as the voice of a patient, careful mind who had seen everything at least twice. None of these people were invited to diplomatic functions. None had ever been asked their opinion by any ambassador before Yael. They were, as a result, remarkably forthcoming. From them, she learned things no briefing document would have contained. She learned which upcoming votes had already been privately decided before the sessions opened. She learned about a financial arrangement between a Soran trade delegation and a junior member world ambassador that created a quiet but genuine conflict of interest. She learned that the Vithara had been lobbying 3 smaller nations in advance of a major resource vote still 2 months away. She filed all of it in the notebook. And then, on a slow afternoon in the 3rd month, sitting in the archive room with Feln, as the archivist cataloged a collection of founding-era procedural documents that had been digitized but never indexed, Yael found it. It was not dramatic. That is the thing that nobody tells you about the moments that change everything. They almost never announce themselves. Feln was working through the documents out of archival duty. Yael was reading alongside out of thoroughness, the same reason she read everything when she reached the 3rd appendix of a supplementary amendment ratified during the Accord's 47th year. The language was old, formal, slightly archaic in the way that the translation system rendered it, but the substance was clear. Any world admitted to the Accord on probationary standing, the clause read, having completed 3 full Accord cycles without a single procedural violation on record, shall be entitled to claim full membership status retroactive to the date of original admission. 3 full cycles. Each cycle was approximately 1 Earth year. Earth had been admitted 11 months ago. Yael had not committed a single procedural violation. She had voted at every session. She had filed every required document on time. She had followed every rule in all 12,000 pages of the Charter precisely, in large part because she was one of the only beings in the chamber who had actually read all 12,000 pages. 1 more month. One more month of clean record, and she could invoke a clause that would give Earth 3 years of retroactive voting rights on decisions that had already been made. She read the clause twice, then a third time.
She looked at Feln, who was focused on a labeling task and had not noticed what she was reading. She wrote the clause number in her notebook. She closed the document. She thanked Feln warmly for the afternoon. She walked back to her quarters through the long curved corridors of Accord Station, and she thought about what she had just found. 3 years of backdated votes meant the legal standing to formally reopen several trade compacts ratified before Earth joined the Accord. Compacts that had quietly placed the star systems closest to humanity's projected expansion corridor under exclusive extraction rights held by the 5 largest council powers. Those systems had been carved out of any human access before Earth was ever in the room, before there was any reason to consult Earth about anything. Nobody had told humanity. There had been no obligation to. Earth had not been a member. Now Earth was a member, and in 1 month Earth would be able to prove it had always been one. She sat down at her desk and began drafting, not in the notebook, in the precise, careful, formally structured legal language of Accord procedure, the kind that left no room for interpretation, no gap for challenge, no loose thread to pull. She wrote the invocation 3 times that night, each draft tighter than the last. When she was satisfied, she saved it, closed everything, and slept. The session that changed everything was not scheduled to be remarkable. The Outer Reach Resource Compact had been in development for nearly a year. It was a sweeping agreement between the 5 largest Accord powers, the Vithara Dominion, the Soren Collective, the Dreth Assembly, the Consolidated Houses of Myron, and the Yessen Authority, to formally designate a broad arc of star systems along the galactic outer reach as open resource territories. Open was a diplomatic word. What it meant in practice was that those 5 powers would hold exclusive extraction rights across the region for the next 250 years. Several of those star systems sat adjacent to Earth's projected expansion corridor, not inside it, adjacent to it, which meant that as humanity grew outward, as it inevitably would, it would find itself surrounded on multiple sides by resource operations it had no legal standing to challenge, negotiate with, or participate in. A quiet wall built before humanity had ever been given a window to look through. The session opened at the standard hour. Yael sat in her seat at the outer edge of the chamber. 51 ambassadors arranged themselves on their platforms. The Vithara administrator opened the agenda. The compact was item 3. Items 1 and 2 passed without difficulty. When item 3 was called, Councillor Breath of the Vithara Dominion rose to formally present the compact for ratification. His voice was low and measured, carrying the particular tone of someone who considers a vote concluded before it has technically begun. He outlined terms, cited supporting documentation, and moved for ratification with the effortless confidence of a being who had been navigating these chambers for longer than human civilization had possessed writing. The Soren ambassador offered the formal second. 3 smaller member worlds registered brief, polite objections that everyone in the hall understood would not affect the outcome. The floor opened for final statements before the vote was called. Yael pressed the request indicator on her desk panel. There was a pause, a small, genuine pause, the kind that happens when a room full of experienced minds encounters something that does not fit the expected pattern. In 3 months, she had never pressed that indicator. The administrator acknowledged her. The tone of it was courteous in the way that dismissal is sometimes dressed as courtesy. She stood up. "Ambassador Yael Darro of Earth," she said, "I have a procedural matter to raise before this body proceeds to a vote." Counselor Breath looked at her for the first time in weeks. Several ambassadors turned with the mild interest of beings watching something unexpected but not yet significant. Under Article 11 of the Accord Charter, specifically the supplementary amendment to the Foundational Compact, ratified in the Accord's 47th year, Appendix 3, Clause 7, the clause of foundational standing, I hereby formally invoke Earth's right to claim full retroactive membership status. She let it land. The silence that followed was unlike anything the chamber had produced in her 3 months of attendance. Not the silence of routine, not the silence of boredom. It was the silence of 51 ancient, experienced political minds, all arriving at the same question at precisely the same moment. She continued before any of them could recover. Earth has completed 3 full Accord cycles without a single procedural violation on record. Under the clause of foundational standing, our voting rights are retroactive to the date of original admission. I am formally filing that invocation with the Accord Secretariat now. She pressed the submission indicator. Across the hall, at the entrance to the document archive corridor, she could just see Feln. The archivist gave the smallest possible nod. Feln had verified the clause 4 days prior at Yael's quiet request, confirming it was genuine, unrevoked, and had never been invoked in the Accord's entire history, because no probationary member had ever read the founding documents thoroughly enough to find it.
The chamber did not shout. These were ancient institutions, and ancient institutions do not shout. But it erupted in the way that such places erupt. A sudden rush of procedural requests, urgent whispered consultations, the sound of 51 translation systems running at maximum capacity as ambassadors communicated rapidly with their staff. Counselor Breath had gone very still. The Soran ambassador, whose expression typically carried a tone of faint amusement at everything, was no longer amused. The Vethara legal team filed an immediate procedural challenge. Yael had anticipated this. She had prepared her response before she walked into the chamber, drawing on 12,000 pages of charter knowledge and 3 months of careful observation. She answered every challenge precisely, citing specific clauses, specific precedents, specific procedural rules that she had learned from a document most beings in that room had never opened past the first 100 pages. The challenge failed. The compact was suspended pending review. Earth's retroactive membership was confirmed by the Accord Secretariat 48 hours later. In the weeks that followed, Yael used those 3 years of backdated voting rights to formally petition for the reopening of the resource compacts covering the systems adjacent to humanity's expansion corridor. She did not demand exclusive rights. She did not posture or threaten. She simply filed the legal motions, precisely and completely in language that could not be dismissed, and she sat in her chair at the edge of the chamber and waited for the process to work. It worked. When the final agreement was reached, humanity granted shared access and consultation rights across the contested systems. Rostov Hale called her from the heliopause relay. She could hear in his voice that he had not slept. "How?" he said. "How did you do it?" She looked at the notebook on her desk, at the page where she had written the clause number on a quiet afternoon in the archive with Feln, while nobody was watching. "I read the manual," she said. There was a long silence on the line. "The entire manual," she added. Another silence. "All 12,000 pages," she said, "including the appendices." Rostov said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "They handed it to you as a formality." "Yes," she said, "they did." That was the thing about being underestimated. The ones who do it hand you every tool you need while they are doing it, and they never notice until the tool has already been used. The Accord had given Yael a rulebook as a gesture of procedural courtesy. They had given her a second-rate earpiece and a too-tall chair and a seat at the edge of the room, and they had not paid attention to her for 3 months. And in those 3 months she had read everything, learned everyone, mapped every fault line in every alliance, and found a clause buried in a 4,700-year-old appendix that no one else had bothered to look for, because no one else had thought it worth the effort. Humanity had been in the room for less than a year. It had arrived as an afterthought, as a temporary measure, as the 5th or 6th choice that nobody had expected to matter. It had not arrived angry. It had not arrived loud. It had arrived with a pen and a notebook and 72 hours of reading, and it had sat quietly in the smallest seat in the room, and it had done its homework. And when the moment came, when the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy stood at the edge of locking humanity out of its own future, a 33-year-old woman from a coastal city in southern Brazil, who had studied treaty law at a university nobody outside her continent had heard of, stood up in the oldest chamber in the galaxy and spoke 11 words that 5,000 years of tradition had never once prepared anyone to hear. No civilization that had ever dismissed a species as unimportant had ever been right. They had simply been early. They would not make that mistake again.
The chamber was never quite the same after that session. Not dramatically. The Accord did not reorganize itself overnight. The Vithara Dominion did not suddenly treat Earth as an equal power. The Sauron Collective did not invite Yael to their diplomatic receptions. Ancient institutions do not transform quickly, and Yael had never expected them to. Transformation, in her experience, was not a single event. It was the accumulation of small, precise, well-timed pressures applied over time against structures that only looked immovable from the outside. She understood that now better than she ever had before, because she had spent 3 months mapping the places where those structures were not immovable at all. The weeks after the invocation were busy in ways that did not show from the outside. Formally, the chamber resumed its regular schedule of sessions and votes and procedural motions. Informally, something had shifted in the room's balance of attention. Ambassadors who had not acknowledged her existence in 3 months now looked at her when she entered, not with warmth, with recalibration, the particular expression of experienced political minds adjusting their models of something they had previously categorized incorrectly. She found she did not mind being looked at. She minded being looked at the wrong way. What changed in the weeks after was not her approach. She continued doing what she had always done. She attended every session. She filed every document. She kept the notebook. She talked to Feln and Barrett and Osu and the dozens of other people who moved through the station's infrastructure, unseen by the ambassadors who needed them. She watched. She mapped. She added new observations to existing ones and waited for patterns to become clear. What she was building was not leverage, not in the way that word is usually understood, as a threat held in reserve. She was building understanding, specific, detailed, actionable knowledge of how this chamber actually worked beneath the formal architecture of its procedures. And she had come to understand that the formal architecture and the actual architecture were 2 different structures that happened to occupy the same space. The Oran Confederation's internal fractures were deepening. Yael had been tracking this for months.
Two of its 6-member species, the Tessari and the Uveln, had been quietly expanding their territorial dispute in ways that the Confederation's joint representative was increasingly unable to manage through procedural unity. The Confederation had held together for 1,000 years through a combination of common interest and political discipline. The common interest was holding, the discipline was fraying. This mattered to Yael for reasons that had nothing to do with exploitation. A fractured Oran confederation meant 6 smaller species potentially losing their collective voice in the chamber, the only significant voice they had. She had watched those 6 species vote for the past 3 months. Their interests were not always aligned with each other, but they were consistently aligned on one category of issue: resource access rights for smaller and newer member worlds. They had voted, every time, for frameworks that gave developing civilizations a fairer standing in extraction disputes. They were, in other words, the most consistent allies Earth could ever find in this room, if they held together long enough to be allies. She approached this carefully, not through formal diplomatic channels, which would have been noticed and possibly misread. She arranged separate informal conversations with each of the Confederation's member species representatives over the course of several weeks. Feln helped her understand which gathering spaces each delegation preferred during off-session hours. Osu quietly arranged her schedule to allow overlap with the right people at the right times. The conversations were not political, not explicitly. They were the kind of conversations that happen when someone takes genuine interest in who you are, not what you represent. She learned about the Tessari homeworld, a place with a complex tidal ecosystem that had shaped their entire approach to territorial boundary making. She learned about the Uveln preference for written agreement over spoken word, rooted in a history of broken verbal compacts so ancient it had shaped their language. She listened in the particular way she had always listened, tracking not just what was said, but what was being protected by the saying of it. By the end of the 5th month, she had a clearer picture of the Tessari-Uveln dispute than the Confederation's own joint representative did, because she had talked to both of them separately, and neither had told the other.
She wrote out a private analysis. Not a proposal, an analysis. A careful, non-prescriptive document that mapped the actual shape of the disagreement as she understood it, stripping away the accumulated interpretations and counter-accusations that had built up over 80 years, and presenting the underlying territorial question as a technical problem rather than a political one. She sent it to both delegations independently, with a note that it was offered as an outside perspective with no stake in the outcome. She did not follow up. She simply made herself available. The Tessari delegation responded first, 3 days later. The Uveln responded 2 days after that. Both asked for a meeting. She met with them jointly in a small conference room off one of the station's secondary corridors, with no translators present except their own, and no record being kept by anyone. She sat across from 2 species who had been locked in an 80-year dispute, and whose political collapse would cost 6 civilizations their collective voice in the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. And she talked to them the way she had always talked to anyone, as though their problem was real and specific and solvable and worth solving. 4 hours later, they had the outline of a framework, not a resolution, a framework, a structure for approaching the actual territorial question through a process both species found acceptable.
Yael provided the procedural template, drawn from an obscure section of the Accord Charter she had memorized on her first night. She suggested a neutral mediation format that had not been used in the Accord for over 2 centuries, but remained technically valid. She asked for nothing in return. She was explicit about this. She had no interest in the outcome of the Tesseri-Uvuln dispute, except that it be resolved fairly and that the Confederation survive it. She said this plainly. They believed her because, she suspected, in 5 months of watching her, they had not seen any evidence to the contrary. 3 weeks later, the Confederation's joint representative submitted a formal mediation request to the Accord Secretariat. The form they used was the one Yael had provided. The neutral mediation format they cited was the one she had found in the Charter. Nobody publicly connected any of it to her. This was fine. This was, in fact, exactly right. She wrote the outcome in her notebook that evening, not as an achievement, as data, a point in a pattern she was building, a demonstration, to herself if no one else, that the chamber's dynamics could be moved by people who were willing to understand them deeply enough to find the places where small efforts could produce large results. She was 33 years old. She was sitting in the outermost seat of a 5,000-year-old institution with a second-rate earpiece and a chair that was still too tall for her desk because no one had fixed it. She had no warships, no leverage, no ancient history of power behind her name. She had a notebook. She had done the reading, and she was only getting started.
The vote that truly changed things happened 8 months after Yael arrived at Accord Station. Not the invocation, that had been the opening move. Brilliant, yes, unexpected, certainly. But in the architecture of a 5,000-year institution, even a brilliant move is eventually absorbed. It becomes a data point, a story that gets told in the corridors, a recalibration in how one particular ambassador is assessed. It does not, by itself, change the shape of the room. What changed the shape of the room was the vote on the Foundational Representation Review. The review had been proposed 3 months prior by a coalition of 11 smaller member worlds, including the now stabilized Oran Confederation, seeking a formal Accord examination of how voting weight was calculated across member civilizations. The current formula had been set 4,000 years ago and had not been substantively revised since. It weighted voting power heavily toward population size and resource output, metrics that naturally and permanently favored the 5 largest powers, which had written the formula in the first place. The review was not a vote to change the formula. It was a vote to examine it, to commission an independent analysis, to formally ask the question. The 5 largest powers opposed it. They opposed it with the particular confidence of civilizations that had never lost a floor vote in living memory. They had the numbers. They had always had the numbers. The mathematics of the chamber had been designed, however unintentionally, to ensure they would continue having them. Yael had spent 2 months preparing for this vote. She had done something that the other ambassadors had not thought to do, or had not cared enough to attempt, or simply not believed was worth the effort. She had talked to every single small member world delegation on the station. Not formally, not through official diplomatic channels that could be monitored and responded to. Through Osu and Feln and Barrett and every other thread of the station's invisible social infrastructure she had been quietly building for 8 months.
Through conversations in secondary corridors and archive rooms, and the unremarkable shared spaces where people who were not ambassadors spent their time. She had listened. She had mapped. She had identified with precision the specific concerns that kept each smaller delegation from supporting the review, despite the fact that it was obviously in their interest. For some, it was fear. The Vathara had been known to make life procedurally difficult for member worlds that voted against Dominion interests. For others, it was skepticism. They had seen reform motions fail before and had learned not to invest in outcomes they could not reach. For two delegations, it was something more specific, a procedural technicality that made their participation in the review's commission structurally problematic given their current membership classifications. For each of these concerns, she had prepared something. Not promises. She had nothing to promise and would not have made promises she could not keep. She had prepared information, precedents from the Charter, historical examples, procedural solutions to the technical problems that she had found buried in appendices no one else had opened. She had shared these things, quietly, individually, with no fanfare and no record, and she had asked nothing in return except honest engagement. She had also spoken to Counselor Breath. This surprised him, she could tell. They had spoken formally exactly once in 8 months, at her invocation. She requested a private meeting, which he granted after a pause long enough to indicate that he was trying to understand her purpose. They met in a small room off the Vathara delegation's corridor. He was larger than he appeared from across the chamber, a being whose physical presence carried the accumulated weight of a civilization that had been navigating interstellar politics since before humanity had metal tools. She told him exactly what she planned to do, not as a warning and not as a negotiation, as a professional courtesy from one person who took procedure seriously to another. She told him the vote count she expected. She told him which delegations she believed were movable and which were not. She told him that the review should pass and that she thought its passage was ultimately better for the Accord's stability than its failure, and that she would be willing to work with the Vathara delegation on the composition of the Independent Commission if they wished to have input rather than simply opposition.
Breath was silent for a long time after she finished speaking. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "You are not what we anticipated." "No," she agreed, "I imagine not." He asked what humanity wanted, not from the review, from the Accord, in the long view. She told him the truth, because it was also the most strategically sound thing to say, and because she had found over 8 months that the most strategically sound thing and the honest thing were usually the same thing in the end. She told him that humanity wanted what every species in that chamber had once wanted before it became powerful enough to stop wanting it, a fair process. Not a guaranteed outcome, a fair process. Rules that meant the same thing for everyone. A chamber where the smallest voice had a real mechanism for being heard. "We do not want to take anything from the Vathara," she said. "We want to build something that works for everyone still young enough to need it to work." Breath said nothing more that meeting. He left without committing to anything. On the day of the vote, Yael sat in her chair at the outer edge of the crescent and watched the indicator panels across the chamber. The 5 largest powers voted against the review, as expected. One by one, the smaller delegations voted. One by one, they came down in favor, including 2 that had abstained on every contested vote in recent memory. including the Aran Confederation, whose joint representative voted unified for the first time in months, including 3 delegations that Yael had spent careful, patient hours talking to in corridor spaces the ambassadors never visited. The final count was 31 to 21 in favor. The Foundational Representation Review passed. The hall processed this result with the slow deliberateness of an institution encountering something it had not expected. Yael sat in her chair and did not smile, because this was not a moment for smiling. It was a moment for being still and letting the result be what it was. Rostov called her that evening from the heliopause relay. She could hear something in his voice she had not heard before in all their conversations. Not excitement, something quieter and more permanent than excitement. "They're asking about you," he said. "The government, the media, everyone. They want to know how you did it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebook on her desk. 8 months of observations, floor patterns and alliance maps and procedural clauses found in appendices no one had indexed in centuries. Names of archivists and technicians and maintenance workers and junior staff who had never been invited to a diplomatic reception. A record of every conversation, every pattern, every small thread she had pulled until she understood how the fabric held together. She thought about the chair that was still wrong, the earpiece that still dropped the occasional syllable, the seat at the outer edge of the crescent that nobody had thought to move. She thought about the way Counselor Breath had looked at her in that private meeting, the moment a 5,000-year-old civilization adjusted its assessment of something it had categorized too quickly. "Tell them," she said, "that we read the manual." Another pause. Then, "That's it?" "That's most of it." She picked up the notebook. The rest was listening, and not assuming that the people nobody talks to don't know anything worth knowing. Rostov was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" She thought about that. She thought about the 31 delegations who had just voted for a process that might, over decades, reshape how power moved through the oldest governing body in the known galaxy. She thought about the Tessari and the Uveln, who were in mediation and holding. She thought about Feln and Barrett and Osu, who had helped her understand a station that ambassadors had occupied for centuries without ever learning. She thought about the chair, still wrong, still too tall, still placed at the far outer edge of the crescent. She had never asked anyone to fix it. "A better earpiece would be a start," she said. Rostov laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh in 8 months. She could hear in it all the tension of the past months releasing at once. The 9 calls asking why she was being quiet, the pressure to be visible, the fear that Earth had sent someone too quiet to matter to a room that had never been quiet in 5,000 years. It turned out that being quiet had been exactly right, that listening had been exactly right, that the notebook and the archive afternoons and the corridor conversations and the 12,000 pages of charter law memorized in 72 hours had all been exactly right. Not because they were the obvious strategy, but because obvious strategies were what the chamber had been defending against for 5,000 years. Humanity had not arrived at the accord with warships or ultimatums or a history of power long enough to command automatic respect. It had arrived late, under-equipped, in the wrong chair, with a second-rate earpiece and no particular reason for anyone to pay attention. It had paid attention to everyone else instead.
and in a chamber built on the assumption that only the powerful could move the powerful, a 33-year-old lawyer from a coastal city nobody outside her continent had heard of had spent 8 months learning where the walls were thin. And then, when the time came, she walked through them so cleanly that the walls had not even realized they had been moved. The notebook went into her bag. The earpiece went back in her ear. Tomorrow there would be another session, another agenda, 12 more items of business in a chamber that was no longer entirely the shape it had been when she arrived. She had not done this by being extraordinary. She had done it by being thorough and patient and genuinely curious about the people that power forgets to notice. That had always been the human way. Not the loudest voice in the room, the one that listened longest, learned deepest, and spoke, when it finally spoke, with everything it had quietly gathered. The stars had been waiting a long time for that voice. They would not have to wait much longer.